Julian's first fatal mistake was a classic corporate vulnerability. He was lazy, arrogant, and he never read the fine print. When I successfully embedded myself as his firm's independent corporate consultant under the name Lenore, I knew a simple public exposure wouldn't be enough. If I just leaked his past, the board of directors would fire him, issue a quiet press release, give him a multi-million-dollar golden parachute severance package, and the company would survive. I didn't want him walking away rich. I wanted him broke, stripped of his title, and completely powerless. He had no idea that beneath my expensive corporate mask was the ghost of a 16-year-old girl he had publicly humiliated and broken for a cheap $200 high school bet. He didn't remember destroying my youth, but I had spent the last 16 years, the exact amount of time I had been alive when he ruined me, molding myself into his ultimate reckoning. I was here to take every single thing he built, reduce his legacy to ashes, and trade his pristine corner office for a concrete cell. 18 months ago, I engineered the first phase of the takeover. I convinced Julian that to look incredibly attractive for an upcoming international merger, the firm needed a massive influx of immediate liquid capital to artificially boost its valuation. I remember the exact afternoon I laid the trap. We were on the 42nd floor of his glass high-rise. He was pouring a glass of scotch, talking about how he was born to run the market. Julian, I told him during a private meeting, sliding a beautifully bound financial restructuring proposal across his mahogany desk. If we issue a new, closed block of Class B preferred voting shares to private institutional investors, we can raise $50 million in less than a week. Your personal ownership stake will look completely impenetrable to the acquisition group. Blinded by the shiny $50 million figure and eager to impress his investors, he swallowed the bait. He signed the corporate authorization without digging into who the buyers actually were. He trusted my credentials completely. He thought I was just a ruthless consultant making him richer. Over the next year, those shares were quietly bought up in small, untraceable blocks by a network of 5 different offshore holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Julian thought he was dealing with random, independent Wall Street investment firms. He had no idea that every single one of those holding companies belonged to a blind trust, and I was the sole beneficiary. I had spent the last decade securing high-level venture backing from his direct market rivals, pooling capital, and waiting for this exact play. I lived below my means, worked 80-hour weeks, and poured every single resource I had into funding those offshore accounts. By month 12, Julian still walked around the building thinking he owned the room, but my shell companies quietly held 51% of the voting power. He was a minority shareholder in his own empire, celebrating a success that was no longer his. To understand why a high-priced corporate consultant would spend a decade of her life meticulously buying up his company from under his feet, you have to look past the tailored suits and the fake name. You have to look back exactly 16 years, to a small suburban town where Julian Vance was the untouchable golden boy athlete and I was a quiet, stuttering 16-year-old girl who hid in oversized sweaters. Back then, I thought I had gotten everything I wanted in life when Julian suddenly started paying attention to me. He sat next to me in class, listened patiently when my stutter kicked in, and eventually invited me to a massive end-of-summer party at his parents' lake house. I thought it was a date. Instead, it was a literal cash bet. Julian had wagered $200 with his popular friends that he could trick the weird, invisible girl into a back bedroom. That night, he spiked my drink. While I was completely helpless, they took compromised photos of me and blasted them to the entire high school. It took him 5 minutes to destroy my youth, leave me publicly humiliated, and force my family to move away in absolute shame. I didn't cry for long, and I didn't seek a sloppy, immediate revenge. I made a cold, silent vow. I would use the other 16 years of my life to plan his absolute, total ruin. I legally changed my name, buried the ghost of that broken teenager, and built a flawless corporate career specifically to become the architect of his downfall. 6 months ago, it was time to execute the final legal trap. I engineered a manufactured financial crisis, leaking a highly convincing, anonymous forensic report to a prominent tech blog stating that Julian's primary startup investment was failing. The report contained just enough real, obscured data to look terrifying. The firm's stock took a sudden, sharp dip. Julian panicked. If the stock didn't stabilize before the final merger audits, the international conglomerate would back out, and his empire would collapse. He called me into his office at 3 a.m, pacing the floor, sweat soaking through his expensive shirt. If the international group sees this volatility, the merger is dead, Lenore, he muttered, his voice cracking. I need capital to buy back our own shares and stabilize the price, but the board will take weeks to approve a fund transfer. I walked into his office with the perfect, illegal solution. Julian, I said, leaning over his desk and opening my laptop to a hidden, unallocated capital reserve account from our latest corporate acquisition. There is $15 million sitting in this reserve fund. It's technically unassigned. You can temporarily route this money into your personal bank account, use it to buy up our dipping stock to artificially stabilize the market price, and then quietly return the money after the merger closes next week. No one will ever notice. Julian hesitated. The shadow of fear finally crossed his face. He rubbed his temples, staring at the numbers on the screen. Lenore, moving corporate acquisition funds into a personal account without a formal board vote? That's highly irregular. If the SEC looks closely at the routing logs during the transition. The SEC won't look, I interrupted, keeping my voice smooth, cold, and utterly confident. I looked him dead in the eye, mimicking the exact tone of absolute certainty he used to possess. The merger closes next week. Once the international conglomerate looked at his legal team, they gave a single, slow nod. They realized in 5 seconds that they were dealing with someone far more dangerous, far more meticulous, and far more powerful than Julian ever was. The lead investor slowly opened his pen, smoothed out the contract, and looked up at me. Let's talk terms, Lenore. 10 minutes later, the boardroom doors flew open. Julian marched in, his face pale, his tie slightly askew, panting as if he had run up the stairs. He looked frantic, completely unraveled. What is going on with my accounts? The bank is saying. He stopped dead in his tracks. The words died in his throat. He looked at the 2 federal agents standing in the corners of the room. He looked at the board members, who actively looked down at the table, refusing to even make eye contact with him. Finally, his eyes traveled up the long glass table and landed on me, sitting comfortably and quietly in the high-backed CEO chair. Lenore, he stammered nervously, his voice cracking as he took a tentative step back toward the door. What is this? I won't. I didn't do anything wrong. Tell them. Explain the transfer. The lead federal agent stepped forward, drawing a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Julian Vance, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud and grand larceny. Hands behind your back. No, wait. There's a mistake. Julian shouted, his voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls. He began to shake, his hands twitching violently as the agent stepped up, grabbed his arms, and forced them behind his back. As the steel cuffs clicked loudly over his wrists, Julian didn't look at the agents. He kept his eyes locked on me across the long glass table. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany trim, looking directly into his panicked, sweating face. I allowed the cold, sharp focus of the 16-year-old girl he had humiliated for a $200 bet to finally surface entirely in my expression. For a fraction of a second, as the reality of the prison sentence settled into his chest, I saw the exact moment the realization hit him. The memory finally clicked. The shape of my eyes, the tone of my voice, the mask fell away. He recognized me. He realized that the quiet, broken girl he had ruined a lifetime ago hadn't just survived, she had spent 16 years becoming the absolute architect of his execution. Lenore, he whispered, his voice completely hollow, his eyes wide with a horror that had nothing to do with the police. Get him out of my office, I said down to the table, my voice echoing with absolute finality. They dragged him out, his leather shoes scuffing loudly against the hardwood floor as he tried to look back one last time. The heavy oak door clicked shut, cutting off the sound of his protests. I adjusted the acquisition papers in front of me, looked up at the remaining board members who were waiting for my command, and picked up my pen. The company was mine. Julian was heading to a federal cell. The ledger was finally balanced.